Today on Blue 58, it's time to start looking ahead to the 2024 NFL season, starting with the Packers' two most important coaches, Matt LaFleur and Jeff Hafley. What's on the line for both this year?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, and I am happy to be with you here for another episode because on this episode, we're starting really to look ahead to 2024. You might have gathered that from the intro there. But I want to set the table here for a little bit. Usually throughout the offseason, we take some time. We look at the NFL draft, we look at the post-draft kind of fallout where the Packers roster sit, and then we try to do some stuff through the offseason, trying to learn a little bit more about this team, about football in general. And then there comes a time when we really have to shift the focus from looking back to looking ahead. It kind of sneaks up on me every year. In all honesty, it's always, the offseason always goes faster than I feel like it should. But here we sit, June 18th, as I record this, barely a month out from the start of training camp. Things get rolling in Green Bay July 22nd and ramp up from there through the end of the 2024 season. And so here we are. We got to start talking our way through this roster in depth if we want to be up to date and on top of things when training camp gets rolling toward the end of July. And we're not even going to get to all the positions if we do one per episode starting now. We'll have to do safeties technically after training camp starts. That's how close we are to the start of this season. So we need to start getting to work now. And I think it's going to be a really enjoyable process getting to work on the 2024 Packers. Because as I sit here and look at this team, I just see so many reasons for optimism and so few reasons for pessimism. If you remember back to last year, I did a little kind of non-traditional episode of Blue 58 talking about why do this? Why keep diving in again and again, knowing that the Packers probably aren't going to win the Super Bowl in any given season. That sounds more pessimistic than I think it really is. If you've done this for a while, and I don't mean like done a podcast about the Packers, I mean just be a fan for a while. We know that chances are in any year, the Packers aren't going to win the Super Bowl. Just pick one single year. You'd be hard-pressed to sit down and say, yep, this is going to be the year. Chances are we're going to be sitting here 7 months from now, saying, man, great season, disappointed at the end. Maybe they should have done this, that, or the other thing differently. Maybe we'll be looking back at decisions they made now and saying, wow, if they'd only done this differently, we might be talking about another trip to the NFC Championship game or the Super Bowl or whatever. But even if it's going to end in disappointment, it's still a fun ride. And I think looking at this year's team, there's a lot of reason to think that this is going to be a pretty spectacular, fun ride. And we'll get to the individual components as we go position by position here. But they've got, an exciting young quarterback, a more skill position talent than we've seen in a long, long time. Just the depth and variety of guys that they have catching the ball, running with the ball, helping Jordan Love move the offense down the field is unparalleled in relatively recent history, the last 6 to 8 years at least. The defense is talented, and they've got somebody new in charge. And all of these pieces individually make up a pretty exciting team altogether. There is a lot to be excited about. And so far, at least, there is very little, I think, to be pessimistic about as you look at the 2024 Packers. So let's try to be pessimistic for a little while. Let's really try to dig deep and get upset and angry about something. Saying that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but we've had a couple interesting discussions, first in our Discord server for the Power Sweep, and then via a question that I got from a listener, kind of that leads me to want to be pessimistic here for a second. Just a second. Because there's so much to be optimistic about. I think it's worth our time to sit here for just a little bit and think about what maybe could go wrong or what reasons would we have to maybe not be so optimistic. And I think that leads us to a discussion about the two most important coaches in Green Bay. All respect to Rich Bisaccia. He does a great job with the limited resources that he's had. But he's not as important to the Packers this year or any year as their head coach or their defensive coordinator. The Packers need more, frankly, out of both of those roles for reasons that we'll talk about if they really want to get over the hump, or maybe not more in the case of Matt LaFleur, but continued good stuff from the head coach if they want to get over the hump and get to the Super Bowl and hopefully win a Super Bowl. And to say that they need more from their defensive coordinator should kind of go without saying, or should it? Got an interesting question this week from Ben via our contact page at thepowersweep.com. Ben wrote in with this question. I'll just read it all verbatim. Fairly long question here, but that's how we like them. Ben writes, quote, I know most Packers fans will not miss Joe Barry, but should they? Last year, the Packers had the 7th-ranked passing defense and 10th-ranked defense by points allowed. Fans may have complained about giving up the frustrating underneath yards, but also Barry's defense took away big plays and seemed to have helped the defense in the big picture, the overall team in the big picture. This is exemplified by their ability to defeat playmaking quarterbacks like Patrick Mahomes. Barry is the only Packers defensive coordinator to not be responsible for playoff meltdowns in recent years, and his defense has actually played decently well in the playoffs. The real weakness was the run defense, and I am not sure Jeff Hafley is the right fit to fix it, with the defense looking to be faster but even smaller than last year, end quote. So before we dive into the particulars of this question and the overall impression of Joe Barry versus Jeff Hafley in general, I think it's worth pointing out that change is always a vulnerable time. This is something we have talked about, had the opportunity to talk about many times over the years at the Packers. Some version of Blue 58 has been going on since 2016. There's been a lot of change in there. We've seen, 3-4 different defensive coordinators since then. Dom Capers was in charge when we started. Then we got Mike Pettin, and then Joe Barry, and then Jeff Hafley now. We've seen 2 different head coaches. We've seen 2 different general managers. There's been a lot of different change that we've gone through. And so I think as Packers fans, if you've sat and thought about this and tried to work through it, just trying to figure out what the best decision is here, you can see that there's a lot of opportunity for change to go both right and wrong. Change is a vulnerable time. And that means that change is an interesting time. The decisions you make during a time of change can affect you for a long, long time. Just look at the last time the Packers changed defensive coordinators. That affected them for 3 years and affected the destiny of a lot of different people along the way. Say the Packers, don't need to change defensive coordinators after the 2020 season because Mike Pettin gets the Packers to the Super Bowl, and whether they win or lose, I think it's going to be hard to fire him after that. Does that change how Aaron Rodgers' career ends in Green Bay? Are the Packers better in 2021 again? Do they have a chance to go on another deep Super Bowl run? Admitting that the defense wasn't necessarily the problem during that playoff run there, but you could see a version of this story playing out where the defense is slightly better and maybe things play out differently at the end of the Aaron Rodgers era. How does that affect what draft picks the Packers have available? Say the Packers win the Super Bowl in 2020 and Aaron Rodgers just retires. What then? What do the Packers look like now? Of course, you would would you trade, as exciting as the Packers look right now, would you trade that for another Super Bowl win in the bag? I think I probably would. But all that to say, change can affect things differently, and you don't have to change that many small things throughout recent history to get a very different picture now. And change doesn't always mean the resulting product is going to be good or better than it was. You can mess this up. Just look again at the last time the Packers had to change defensive coordinators. I don't think even if you're like a question asker here, even if you're not sure about Jeff Hafley, if you had the chance to at least try somebody different than Joe Barry, you would probably do that even if the result was not guaranteed. All that to say, the Packers went through a pretty big change this past offseason, and Ben points out, I think a lot of people are assuming that things are going to be better, me included. But are we sure about that? Let's just check in on a couple of things. First, some true things about Joe Barry. Ben is correct that there were no major playoff meltdowns on his record. That's not necessarily a strong point in his favor, but a point nonetheless. Mike Pettin can't say that, and Dom Capers can't say that for relatively recent comparisons. On top of that, the defense did have some pretty good aspects. We went over this toward the middle of last season as we started to think about, what are the Packers going to look like at the end of 2023. Joe Barry could have strolled into Matt LaFleur's office or Brian Gutekunst's office or anybody in the front office and say, look, I have held up my end of the bargain. I've put together some pretty good defenses, and when it's come down to it, you've had very winnable games where the offense just hasn't been able to put points up. The 2021 loss to the 49ers in the playoffs, I mean, if not for a blocked punt that turned into a touchdown and a terrible day at the office for the offense, you're probably looking at an NFC Championship game appearance against a team we can't forget that the Packers had already beaten that year in the Los Angeles Rams. At the end of 2023, or 2022, excuse me, the game slipped away from the Packers against the Lions down the stretch there. They had a couple drives where they could have stopped the Lions there, to be sure. But if the offense played like they'd played for the previous month, it really wouldn't have been an issue, and the Packers would have been into the playoffs. Even though there was a disappointing game-winning drive given up at the end of the 49ers game in 2023, again, the Packers had a chance to tie or win that game in San Francisco this past year, except they just couldn't. They gave away a turnover there at the end, even though they had the chance to tie the game there. They could have won that game in San Francisco. You never know what happens with a slightly better offensive performance. On top of that, just by the raw numbers, the Packers had a top 10 scoring defense last year. They were never worse than 17th with Joe Barry. They had a top 10 passing defense each of the last 3 years, top half in tackle grade from Pro Football Focus every year, top 2 in 2021, top 12 in takeaways twice, 2021 and 2022. Joe Barry has a lot of things going for him if you just want to look at the raw numbers. Are these reasons, though, to be worried about Jeff Hafley? I don't think so, though. I don't think that just because that Joe Barry had some things about, when you look back at his record, when you look back and say, well, he did all these things, just because he did those things doesn't mean that we should be worried about Jeff Hafley necessarily being worse just because maybe regression of some kind or things turning around. Because a lot of the things that Barry did do well, like limiting big plays, are things that any defensive coordinator should be able to do, I think, to the level that Joe Barry did, especially with the talent the Packers have, and that Jeff Hafley still has to work with. The Packers haven't lost a lot of defensive talent, especially in the secondary. They've upgraded there. They've still got Jair Alexander. They've got basically the same linebacking core last year. Just swap in Edgerrin Cooper for Devondre Campbell, and the defensive front is still relatively the same. Put a pin in that. We'll come back to it. Also, a lot of the good things about Joe Barry are kind of fake too. When you look at the raw numbers, they do look good. Some of the scoring stuff, the yards, they do look good, but we also have to keep in mind that the Packers faced the fewest defensive possessions of any team in the NFL last year. They may look okay in the aggregate, but on a drive-to-drive basis, Joe Barry's defense was one of the worst in the NFL. If you just look at the rate at which they were giving up points per drive, and there was almost nobody worse than them. They just, on a given possession, you had a pretty good chance of scoring points against Joe Barry's defense. All this to say, kind of getting to the crux of Ben's question here, should we be worried about Jeff Hafley? You may think that my answer would be a pretty firm no, but instead I'm going to just say maybe. Because I think at the tail end of the question here, Ben has a really good point in that the personnel on the front really hasn't changed all that much, and in fact they've gotten a little bit smaller, swapping in Edgerrin Cooper for Devondre Campbell. This was something we pointed out last year. You can blame Joe Barry, blame the schematic decisions and things like that, but a lot of the things that were going wrong with the Packers on defense, especially in the first half of the last year, was just guys not playing very well. Look at the way that they played against the Atlanta Falcons, guys getting suckered by a read option in a key moment. That's not something that is the coach's problem. When you've got a guy sitting there and trying to read a play and reading it wrong, sure, you can coach things a certain way, but if the guy just misses the play, he misses the play. missed tackles. There is some coaching aspect to that, but Hafley can't or Berry can't go out there and make the tackles himself. And when you've got guys like Jair Alexander being banged up for most of the Berry tenure, Devondre Campbell getting hurt down the stretch, Rasul Douglas getting traded, Quay Walker struggling at times. Some of that is coaching, to be sure, but other times just not playing to his potential and then getting hurt. Innumerable other guys getting hurt at various points. That's not really a Berry problem. And those same problems, I think, could be present for Jeff Hafley. The run defense that got hammered last year at points is still going to be made up of many of the same players. You've got Campbell out and Cooper in. Sure, that's a change, but how big of a change is that in net? I don't know if we really know at this point. Xavier McKinney and Javon Bullard are here, but at safety, how big of a defensive change are they going to make in terms of defending the run? You've got the defensive line with no new additions really at all of substance. You've got year 2 Lucas Van Ness, but you've also got Preston Smith being a year older. If there is a concern for Jeff Hafley, this is it. The personnel that underperformed under Joe Berry is still here. And I think until we start seeing what Joe Berry can or Jeff Hafley can do, we can't assume that it's just going to be better just because it's a different guy calling the shots. I tentatively agree with Ben here that we shouldn't just assume that the defense is going to be better. Let's not assume anything about this defense at all until we see it on the field. I think there's good reason to be encouraged about Hafley. I think there's good reason to be encouraged about his process, about the way that he talks about the game, and the fact that he's, I think, a lot more of an original thinker than Berry was, than a guy who comes in and tries to just mimic things that other people do. There's a difference, I think, between Hafley running stuff that he learned from Robert Saleh or that he's learned from working under these other defensive coordinators that have been good, Mike Pettin, just as an example, then Joe Berry kind of taking from what he's seen be successful from around the league that he didn't necessarily learn super in-depth firsthand. He did coach under the former Chargers, Brandon Staley. There you go. Brandon Staley in Los Angeles. But if you're talking about like firsthand knowledge with Fangio tree stuff, which is what they wanted him to run, not a ton of firsthand knowledge. He tried to run a Wade Phillips style 3-4 defense previously. Didn't have a ton of firsthand knowledge there. It's a different sort of thing looking at what Berry's track record was and seeing what Hafley's track record is. It is different, and I think that you can have some reason for optimism while still not just assuming that it's going to be better. So cautiously optimistic, but let's not assume anything about the defense until we see them on the field. The second topic I wanted to talk about today is a very provocative question from our Discord. Which is this: what if Matt LaFleur actually isn't a good coach? More on that in a second. First, I want to remind you that you can join our Discord by supporting us at patreon.com/thepowersweep or thepowersweep.substack.com. Any dollar amount at Patreon gets you in there. We have just one subscription tier on Substack because that's how they do things. But if you want to join in on those discussions and want to find out what we're doing or talking about or all of those things, that's the place you do it. That's the way that you do it. That is one of the best benefits that I think we can offer you as a supporter of the Power Sweep, just those conversations with Packers fans from all over the world. So hit up patreon.com/thepowersweep or thepowersweep.substack.com and get your way into that Discord server today. So this provocative question is one that we bandied around a little bit about a month ago in the Discord, and I think it's the perfect thing to talk about as we kind of set the stage for Matt LaFleur here in 2024. I think we generally assume that Matt LaFleur is a good coach. I think there's lots of reasons to think that. Just what he's built in Green Bay, the culture, the way that things have improved under LaFleur from where they were in the late McCarthy era, things look pretty good overall. But what if we wanted to make the case that Matt LaFleur isn't a good coach? That's really the crux of the question that we discussed. If you wanted to put forth evidence that Matt LaFleur actually isn't that good of a coach, what would you do? If you wanted to make a better argument than just, I don't like Matt LaFleur because, I don't know, he spends a lot of time on his haircuts. He seems to really be worried about his appearance. He I don't like his personality. I think his offense is all smoke and mirrors. It doesn't really have that much schematic basis in what works, or I don't know. Maybe you've got your reasons. If you really wanted to nail something down where you could say, this is my reason for thinking that Matt LaFleur is not a good coach, what would you say? Well, even though I happen to think that Matt LaFleur is a good coach, I think there are some things that you could point to as some things that maybe he doesn't do super well. For one thing, we've got some coordinator hires that have not gone particularly well for that Matt LaFleur. Joe Barry, of course, is the kind of premier example here, but special teams coordinators Sean Menenga and Maurice Drayton did not exactly set the world on fire either. Now, Menenga may have been a part of a Mike Pettin sort of package deal. He had some connections to Pettin when he was hired. Got to give him, I think, a little bit of grace for where he came in 2019. I don't think the Packers gave him a ton of leeway in what he was looking to hire in terms of special teams coordinators there. That said, we've got 3 fairly bad coordinator hires on his record, and that's something that he gets to own, whether it was entirely his fault or not. So I think that's where you would start if you want to talk about some problems with Matt LaFleur. There's also some consistent issues with, I guess, sticking points on the lower end of the roster. These are guys that just keep popping up in the lineup regardless of whether or not they should be in the lineup. Jake Hansen was a whipping boy in this podcast for a long time, and I feel bad about that in retrospect because it very clearly was not his fault. The Packers, whether it was Matt LaFleur or Adam Stenavich, just wanted him on the field and on the roster for some reason, even though we had tons of evidence that that was not a good idea. The same sort of went for Royce Newman. The Packers kept giving him chances even though that they had better options on the field. It took far too long to get to Zach Tom because the Packers are trying to stick with Royce Newman for reasons that are not entirely clear in retrospect. We saw this same thing play out with Darius Shepard way back in 2019, a punt returner that the Packers just kept putting out on the field despite increasing evidence that he could not do the job, which would be one thing if it was an isolated case, but we saw the exact same thing with Amari Rodgers not too far in the future, just could not get the job done, and yet he kept getting chance after chance after chance, despite little reason to keep giving him those chances. And that, I think, is kind of a recurring feature with Matt LaFleur. He is kind of slow to get involved in change. Here's another one, just slow to make changes or get involved in changes. And look at those struggles with punt returners. It's been the same thing for years. We saw struggles year after year after year with guys back there, and Matt LaFleur did not do anything about it. The general defensive performance struggled for a long, long time before he decided to get involved, and kudos to him for finally getting involved, but it didn't have to take that long. Just elementary level changes that were not made in the defense for far too long, and that, I think, reflects pretty poorly on the head coach. There's also, I think, some roster wastage on an archetype that Matt LaFleur has tried to make happen for a long, long time. It pains me to say this, that it has not worked, but the H-back tight end archetype has not really ever happened for the Packers. They have tried it with Josiah DeGuara, with John Lovett, with Dominique Daphne. It just has not worked out. They really have wanted that Kyle Juszczyk guy in Green Bay for a long time, and there's just very little reason to think that it's going to change or succeed with how it's worked so far. They've kind of shifted toward a more traditional fullback over the past couple of seasons, really just last season, but Henry Pearson will get another crack at trying to do that this year. But he's really tried to stick with this archetype, and it just has not worked. He's tried the same thing again and again and again, and it really has not added all that much to the offense. Getting really specific at the game level, we seem to have multiple games per year where the team just comes out just completely not ready to play. 2019, both losses to San Francisco and their loss to the Los Angeles Chargers on the road in California. We don't need to go over the Los Angeles game, but Richard Sherman very pointedly called out the Packers for this, and this was something the Packers were saying in the media. Last time, he said, basically paraphrasing, but after the 2019 championship game, he's like, look, last time we played them, they said that they weren't ready. And this time they came out flat again. What do you have to do to get ready? Like, when are you going to be ready? When are you going to be ready to play against us? And of course, it hurts as a Packers fan to hear him say that. But the unfortunate thing is that he was accurate there. Like, what is it going to take for you guys to get ready? Are you not professional football players? Like, what do you need here? Why aren't you ready to play? Well, we see that come up again and again. 2020, the Packers got pasted right out of the gate by the Buccaneers, 38-10, just got walked all over in that game right out of a bye. Week 1 in 2021, sure, some mitigating circumstances there, but just get obliterated by the Saints. Completely not ready to play. 2022, so many games from which to choose, but the Commanders' loss near the middle of their midseason slide there really sticks out. You've also got their first loss to the Lions, just sleepwalking, tired-looking game. They were not ready to play. Last season, I might point to the Giants game, losing on Monday Night Football as favorites, losing to the Buccaneers at home late in the season, just not really ready to play. And it's something that seems to happen to the Packers every year, just a couple of games where they are not competitive really at all. You've also got some situational over-cleverness, I think, with Matt LaFleur from time to time. The really pinnacle of this example is the late-game decision-making against the Buccaneers in the 2020 NFC Championship game. I don't want to talk about that game any more than we have to, but just look at how Matt LaFleur handled the end of that game, choosing to kick a field goal instead of going for a score late to cut the lead to 5 when they would have had a chance to tie the game with a touchdown and a 2-point conversion. They really hadn't slowed the Buccaneers down much in that game. They were banking on a defense that had not done it to slow down the Buccaneers and maybe give the Packers a chance to win there. Yeah, well, as we all know, that did not come to pass, and that, I think, is something that you see with Matt LaFleur from time to time. But I will say that none of these are overly compelling to me for a few reasons that I still find worth noting. First, I think they all show that even good coaches have room for growth. These are things that we've seen some change on with Matt LaFleur over the past couple of years. I think he is more decisive now than he was earlier in his tenure. Yes, it still maybe takes him a little bit too long to get involved on some things, but the changes have come hard and fast this offseason with some personnel things and with some roster stuff that I think, of course, Brian Gutekunst gets credit for that too, but also speaks to Matt LaFleur being a little bit more decisive as well. I think this also speaks to the importance of self-scouting. If I sat down and went over my weaknesses as a podcaster or a writer or whatever, which I try to do from time to time, maybe not as often as I should, but they're always illuminating and helpful. And I really doubt that Matt LaFleur is ignorant of any one of these things. He's always quick, and it's probably just a crutch at this point, but he is quick to say, that's on me. That's something that I have to improve on. We've heard that again and again in postseason or post-game press conferences, to the point last year that it almost became a little bit of a meme with his defense of Joe Barry. Like, yeah, it is on you. This is the guy that you picked. Why isn't he doing better? That, of course, yeah, it is on you when you let stuff like this go on. But all that to say, I don't think any of these would be things that caught Matt LaFleur by surprise. Finally, I think all of these things, when you look at them, show the central importance of Matt LaFleur this year. He kind of is the crux for this 2024 Packers team. The Packers have big needs in a few different areas. They need continued development, first from Jordan Love, but then from all of their young players. And Matt LaFleur is the one who's going to be directing most of that, either directly with his involvement with Jordan Love or indirectly through the coaches that he's put in place. His decision-making is going to be crucial for the Packers again this year, just as it is for every year. How does he deploy his resources? How does he use the limited time that he has, the same limited time that every coach in the NFL has, but how does he use his resources this year and make the decisions that are going to help the Packers throughout the 2024 season? And then just the coaching decisions. Will this be third time being the charm on defensive coordinators that he's worked with? The Mike Pettin situation was kind of an arranged marriage. I don't think the Packers wanted to make a change to go to a very young head coach and stick him with his first defensive coordinator hire. I don't know if that's the best way of going about things, but it's the one the Packers chose. So can't really hang too much of Mike Pettin on LaFleur, I don't think. but he gets to wear the Barry hire for sure, and he's going to be responsible for whatever happens with Jeff Hafley. So will that third time be the charm? Will his coaching decisions pay off? Will Jeff Hafley, in a way, kind of a step down from being a head coach to being a coordinator here, a first-time NFL-level defensive coordinator, will that move work out for him? There's a lot on the line for both LaFleur and Hafley this year, both in terms of what Hafley can do for LaFleur and for LaFleur putting Hafley in a situation where he gets to do something that he's never really done before. He's been a co-defensive coordinator. He's been a head coach. He's never been a defensive coordinator at the NFL level. I guess we'll see this year if that proved to be a good decision for both Matt LaFleur and for Jeff Hafley. So I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. It's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.